So welcome to everybody to high leverage practices, session 3. And so far we've gone over, click that slide. So far we've gone over in the other sessions, we've gone over prioritizing basically HLPs 11, 12, and 13, identifying and prioritizing learning goals, then move to explicit instruction, some of those nuts and bolts, explicit instructions, scaffolded supports, the cognitive strategies, started to get into those nuts and bolts. And now we're going to look at access, the grouping of students, the engagement of students. So we're going to move into that. I got the last couple sessions are posted on our Padlet. You can go back and look at. I don't want to spend a lot of time going through those, but this is session 3 after following HLPs 11 through 16. So 17, 18, and 21 tonight. And the objectives. I'm not clicking. Are you clicking for me?
Sorry.
No,
Sorry.
That's all right. I should have nodded. I want to get right to the meat of it for you. Understand the principles of flexible grouping. And the principles behind that are important because we tend to just jump into, let's use flexible grouping without thinking about what it really entails to be successful. We'll go through that tonight. Identifying the purpose and using active engagement strategies. I like to think of that as not just engagement, hands-on. You hear hands-on all the time. I talk about minds-on. They need to be engaged cognitively. So use that minds-on engagement. So the purpose and use of that, and then identifying those strategies to aid students in retention and generalization of new learning. I'll just throw in there, cognitive chewing is a term that I've heard. Allowing kids to ponder over and make that new information their own. So how do we help them retain? It may be learning for the moment, but truly learning is learning for that long haul. So how do we help with that retention and generalization so they can apply that to disparate situations, different situations. So with that said, I'm going to turn it over to
Nikki's gonna be next.
Sure, absolutely. So welcome to those of you who are here. We wanted you to take just a moment to share a technique if you're willing. So think about so far some of your favorites that you use in your classroom. And just to get your brain working today, we'd like for you to share, is there a technique that you use to engage students in a lesson, or a technique where you use to help group students for learning? So one of your favorites in those. So just share your faves with the group. Alana loves the snowball. I've heard you talk about that a couple of times this week. All right. And there are lots of great ones that we're going to share in today's session. We're going to be spending some time with grouping and ways to use both flexible and random grouping, different ways to group students. I love William just shared humor and visuals. Definitely, I've seen some great examples of relationships and some of that humorous interaction between teacher and students this week in some of the observations I've done. Thank you, Alex, for sharing an interactive introduction. We really want to make sure that that first, that hook for our students, that first piece that they encounter of the content is really engaging and gets their brains working. Thank you all for sharing those different options as we go through. And use your chat throughout today if you hear something that you use regularly in your classroom. Please go ahead and throw a like in the chat so that we know that's something that's also a favorite of those of you who are in the group today. So we would appreciate you engaging in that way as we go through. But we are going to jump into high leverage practice number 17, and the practice itself is use flexible grouping. And that means what we want to do is we want to form flexible groups that are mixed ability. So students of all different ability and skill levels throughout. We also want to encourage collaboration and participation. And we can do that by grouping students by interest sometimes to make sure that they have other things in common other than their strengths or struggles with content. And finally, we want to utilize just a variety of response techniques. techniques. And those are the three pieces that we'll dig a little more deeply into here over the next few slides. I skipped one, sorry. So first and foremost, we wanted to define a few pieces of grouping terminology for you. Flexible grouping is when we have diverse groups that change regularly based on student interest or characteristic. So flexible means that they're changing all the time, right? So we're not saying, you are labeled as a bluebird and you stay there all school year long, or you stay there for the whole entire term, or those kinds of things. This means that as our students, they're able to work with different students in the class in different groups and situations all throughout the school day and throughout the week and throughout the month. It doesn't mean we're stuck with those same people kind of over and over. Fixed grouping is ability-based groups that stay the same over time. Great examples of this would be your class-wide intervention groups. So if you're really trying to work at that tier 1 and pair students based on a particular skill level, you do want those partnerships to stay the same over some time, just to kind of monitor that intervention and how it's going. Finally, mixed ability groups. These are groups of students who differ in demographic characteristics and academic competence. So we've got a group we group our students so that it's not always the same. It's always we don't want it to be always our students with IEPs in this group. No, we're going to mix it up and make sure that everybody has the opportunity to work with those who are different and those who are alike. Research tells us that the best you'll get the highest gains from flexible mixed ability groups. So when they change often and when they are filled with students who are not all the same. Although it is important to know that there are points where things like fixed grouping does make a positive difference. We just have to choose that. We have to choose that wisely for our purpose.
Nikki, might that be high ability? Students identified for high ability? I don't know. I'm just asking. At high,
Yeah.
at fixed.
That's a great example of that. When it comes to some of that fixed grouping, our students who are high ability have shown in the research to have a slightly higher impact when they stay together with other high ability students. But even that is not quite as high as having flexible mixed ability groups that change over time. So the research does show that having those high ability students mixing with students who are like them and not alike is going to be more beneficial than just staying with high ability students.
Okay, thanks.
Welcome. So some ways that we can group our students, and this is where I'd love to hear what your experiences are. Those of you who would like to share in the chat, you please do so as things come up here. When it comes to grouping techniques, there are some kind of big ones that come up in our classroom. The first is random assignment. This is where you pull sticks from the jar, or pulling names or sticks from the jar, rolling the dice. Anytime you have a computer program pair students based on some, with the random technique, that it just reduces bias. It means that as teachers, we're not thinking about, well, these two seem to be friends or don't seem to be friends or whatever else. We do the random assignment. Obviously, I think there are so many times in my teaching career where I did mostly random assignment, but then there would be a couple of students I knew I do have to more intentionally pair those students just to make sure everyone can be successful. So, but random assignment is one technique. Another is a systematic assignment. When we use a systematic assignment, the goal for teachers would be to be heterogeneous within the group, but homogeneous across the different groups. So making sure that they can be based on skill level, and it's created privately by the teacher. So that means that all students are getting those needs met across, but the particular small group has something in common. This could align with some of those MTSS practices that you may be familiar with, where you identify a skill where the student is weak, and then we pair them for small group instruction to meet that particular skill. That systematic assignment is going to be beneficial for students because they're getting exactly what they need during that flex time or win time, or whatever time you call it in your classroom. The third option there on the screen, a grouping technique, is called split half pairing. This one is going to be very effective in that class-wide intervention that I mentioned earlier. When it comes to trying to intervene for your 1.5 MTSS 1.5, where your students, many of your students are struggling with a concept. So it's not a small group you need to pull, but instead you need to do an intervention with many of your students. That's where the split half pairing can be most beneficial. That is where you're going to create a similar skill gap between students. So it's not going to be your highest student, your number 1 identified student with your number 20. That's too big of a skill gap. And as John kind of brought up earlier, your high ability students would generally feel, or generally in the research, it shows that they would not have as many gains when they're paired in that way. But when you have a similar skill gap that you pair them by, that would be something like pairing student number 1 on your list with student number 15, student 2 with student 16, and then so on and so forth, 3, 17. That means that the skill gap is the same for each pairing, even though the kind of high low of each is different. You want to, in those pairings, make sure that you're using the skill level of the lower student. So calling on that higher student to be able to use those skills of, being able to bring the other student up. And as part of that teaching process, that's where they'll get those gains that the research shows that class-wide intervention has such a good positive impact on students. All right, I see some stuff in the chat. I'm sorry, my chat keeps disappearing. I want to share a couple of those. Alana said she saw a wheel of randomness to pair students and the kids really liked it. It was an app online, right? Where it was a wheel of randomness and it just picked the kids as it went. The other thing, Alex shared, my experience is primarily special education. So fixed grouping and then flexible grouping are the most common two used. And these are where we see the most common in classrooms as well. That fixed grouping, we try to make sure it's purposeful, as mentioned. So if it's going to stay consistent over time, is it purposeful and meeting the needs of the student and the curriculum in that piece? All right, and that is where a fixed grouping would work. I'm hoping you're thinking of that as with your students with IEPs, they're identified as having the IEP, and so sometimes they have those. Sometimes they have those different. They'll have a different class or something like a resource group. Those things are fixed because they're services that are offered there. I hope I'm understanding that right, Alex. And then William also shared low tech, drawing cards for random pairs, just drawing a card. We've seen that. We do it sometimes even in our trainings. Find an ace, find someone with the opposite suit, find someone with a similar suit, different things like that. So great ideas, everybody, for those grouping techniques. Lots of, by mixing it up, we show our students that, they have lots of opportunity to work with other students. And also that gives us the opportunity to make sure that our students know that they're not always going to have to work with the same student, because we know we can get value from a discussion with all students in the classroom. It helps build that sense of belonging as well. All right, and some ways with that, we want to, when we group students, we know the value is in the conversation that they're having, in the interactions they're having with one another, and the interactions that they're having together with the content. So we want to consider things like accountability. When we put our students in groups or pairs, what is the role that each person is expected to play? And this piece goes along with some very explicit instruction. We know that our students need to be taught how to behave in those groups. We know that they need to know what their role is in the group, and it could change regularly in different settings. So in some literacy groups, for example, you could have someone who's the questioner, someone who's the responder, someone who is the summarizer. Everyone could have a role in that reciprocal teaching piece. And then you can get to math, and in math it could look a little different. Maybe one student is the one who goes to get the manipulatives and the other student is the one who records the work that's being done. Everyone has a role in that. Alana has shared some great examples of, if you're doing any kind of poster or assignment where they all turn in one assignment, asking each to use a different color pen or marker so that you can see what each student contributes to the group in the end, at the end of the assignment. Also making sure that you consider proximity. So the more that you are encouraging group participation. That doesn't always mean that you have to jump into the group and join their conversation, but you can, of course, but also just being near the conversation to eavesdrop and to know later when you debrief that you can share some of those things you heard. That brings that value to the participation in the group, and also helps them to see that the teacher values what they have to say and shares it with the whole group as well. You also want to make sure that you offer lots and lots of that positive feedback when students are working in groups. Say out loud as much as possible what's going really well. You really like the noise level. You love that you hear students using disciplinary vocabulary and content. You love, I love that I just heard the word biosynthesis 3 times. It's one of our vocabulary words this week, and I heard everyone using it in context. So those kinds of things really encourage students to participate appropriately in the group, as well as to interact with the content in that meaningful way. And then I'm going to
You have
share.
some good points, Nikki. I wanted to
Yeah.
jump in as well as when I walk in as a principal. That is so important to know that those expectations have been taught and are being monitored, and students are taught how to communicate in a group. Because when we look at those soft skills or those skills that employers want, how do they interact when they disagree? It's okay to disagree. That's how we generate more ideas. It's how you present that. What are those norms for that group when it comes to discussion? Everybody being heard. When there's a disagreement, how do you respond? You use names with each other. Hey, Alana, thank you for that. Nikki, thank you. We teach them norms. So that's what I would look for. I would look for that engagement that's minds on, is orderly, even though it may be loud. That's okay. But is it orderly? And what I would ask, what is the outcome for that group? What skill or content knowledge are you looking for as a teacher that you'll get that feedback and you'll know, yes, they understand, no, they don't understand, what's your next step? So I'd be looking for that content specific focus for these various groups. What are you expecting to see as an outcome of those groups? I just wanted to throw that in.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. No, thank you, John. Making sure that we know what the accountability piece of it is for all of our students and for ourselves as teachers. If I'm having them work in this group, I need to know the goal so that I can articulate it to my students and know how we'll all be successful, identifying those pieces. Thank you. I also saw in the chat, what do we do when there's a student who completes just their role? So if my job is, say, to go get the supplies, well, my job is done. And that is a great question. There are some ways to really embed that. I had a student once who was very literal in everything that he did. And if he was I taught language arts, and if he was the summarizer, he would not really interact beyond I shared my summary. That's what I did. He was motivated by the fact that I finally explained very explicitly that everyone's, the grade is based on the entire group's experience. So if you, in the end here, it's not just the summary part, they had accountability, they had to turn in a final piece on it. It's not just the summary that you get the grade for. So you also have to be checking, encouraging others. I made that student a particular checklist that applied to all of the different group activities we did that said, in the group, you have your role. Plus, you also have these things. You have to be an encourager of your group mates. You have to be a questioner to make sure that what they say and do is correct. And we practiced with this particular student ways to question someone politely, and using good manners with that. But I went through, that student had a checklist because with the rest of the students, that was, say, common sense. They felt like that was a social skill they understood, that they all participated. This student needed that extra support, that scaffold, and I provided that through a visual checklist for that student. And that was something that worked. John, Alana, or anyone else, do you have any additional thoughts on that about?
Yeah, so I had a reflection sheet for the group work, how they thought they were as a member of the group, according to the expectations and the norm of our group. So they had to rate themselves after every group project, and I would look to see if the feedback, and they'd have to have evidence. Why were you a good group member today, or why not, or something like that? And they could grow. We kind of had those talks though, but everything was taught very explicitly, and the expectations, because kids don't just know how to act in the group or what it is. But I think those reflection sheets did help for some of those. I taught middle school, some of those students in those settings, that everybody did their role, like you said, the summary, but also what kind of a member do you think you were and why? And then we kind of had that bigger conversation of what it means to be a group. So that was one of the tools that I used in my classroom as well.
That's really powerful. Didn't we have in a previous session those question stems, that video
Mhm.
with the question stems? That would be good for Alex and William if you weren't in on that, or to go back and look at that. There was that video about the teacher who had those stems and taught the group how to interact using each other's name. I agree with this part, but I disagree on this. I mean, they actually had those guided conversations. So I think we had it on number, I don't know. We did
I'll go
have it,
back
right?
and yeah. It was part of one of our sessions. I'll find it and
Okay.
share that as well. I'll make sure it's on the Padlet as a separate piece when we finish here today.
It's a good resource, I think.
Yeah, thank you. That's a good reminder. All right. Let's see. So when you want to look at how to encourage students to respond within groups, some things to consider, something like numbered heads together, where the group of 4, oh, thank you. Someone said session 2 is where that was at. Thank you. Numbered heads together is a great one where the entire group can discuss the answer, but within that, say it's a group of 4, everyone has a number 1, 2, 3, or 4. You pull a ping pong ball in the front or whatever it is, and if number 2 is called, the number 2 in each group has to share. So that accountability piece means that every student in the group would have to be fully accountable for the content and be prepared to share, and that's how the group shows what they know during that session. The other things like jotting thoughts, making sure students have sticky notes they can write their ideas on, but then again, that's your individual thought they're sharing on a sticky note and then putting it into something bigger. The same thing could be true for writing on a poster in those different colored markers or pens, just making sure that each student has a way to share individually. Sometimes that helps with wait time as well. It gives them a moment to get their thoughts out before they start hearing everyone else's thoughts in the group. Another option would be the Sage and Scribe, where one teaches and one records and then switch. So making sure you keep switching roles that way. But let's say you're doing 3 questions in a group. Within those 3 questions, perhaps I could be the one who finds the information, someone else records it, and then we switch, those kinds of things. And then finally, the showdown is a great one. Everyone answers individually, maybe on a whiteboard, something like that, and then you share and discuss within the group, and maybe even share out to the entire class, depending on what that formative feedback, shows the teacher as you're circulating. Okay. Some other response techniques for the whole group. So sometimes our students aren't in small groups, they're just all together in the class, but we still want to make sure we're getting those really high quality responses to make sure that they're interacting with us and with the content. That could be that mirrors on. This has been a big one. It's a popular tool with the Haggerty program. So elementary teachers have been using this a little more often in the last couple of years. But with that mirrors on, the students echo the teacher's phrase and movement. So mirrors on, and they have to put their mirrors up and then, mirror exactly what the teacher does and says. There's also broken mirrors. That's a great one. There's some great videos on broken mirrors. If you look for whole brain teaching, that's where the student echoes the teacher's phrase, but fills in the blank. So the teacher intentionally leaves out certain words or concepts so that you can review with students. You can see what they remember previously. It's a great way to collect that formative data as you go through. There's also things like fist to 5. Show me on a scale of 0 to 5 how well you're understanding this topic. Is it 0, I'm totally lost, or 5, get out of the way, I could teach this class for you? Fist to 5. Sometimes we do, secret showings of fist to 5 where you ask your students or participants to hold it closer to their chest so there's more privacy. Sometimes you have some who put up their 0 proudly or their 1 proudly. With littler students, you always want to remember to let them know 1 finger with their pointer finger so that you don't end up getting a whole class of middle fingers, right? So those are some great response techniques for the whole group. And there's also some digital response techniques. There are some great ones. Plickers is a great one. Nearpod gives you the opportunity to engage with the content and with your students in a unique way. There's also responders like Kahoot or Blookit, depending on which one, and there's several others like that. These are some great ones on the screen that you see. Things like Quiz Sockets or Mentimeter. These are all excellent options. They also change pretty regularly. So if you have a favorite that you don't see on the screen that you use, we'd love for you to share so we can keep sharing other ones with teachers from all over the state. So if there's another favorite you have, we'd love to hear about it with those digital response techniques, because technology is always changing on us. All right, and with that, I'm going to turn you over to Alana.
All right. So this is just we call it a case study if we're in person, but we're just going to think about this right now. I'm going to read it out loud, and then we're going to come back to it and talk about how we could change this up. So thinking about ways to actively engage students while I read. Mr. Sanchez was having difficulty with managing behavior during his math lessons. He thought he was doing a good job of delivering the content, but he noticed that the same few students were answering him. The rest were causing interruptions, yelling out, or seemed bored. He needs to increase engagement while giving students a chance to practice the content. He would also like to gauge who needs further help more quickly. So we're just going to think about those things. And actually, we get to go to classrooms a lot for observations. And this is kind of maybe a typical math lesson that we sometimes see. So this is just in the back of our mind, and then we're going to think about HLP 18, and we're going to think about ways to increase engagement through the HLP. So Nikki, can you advance the slide? Thank you. All right. Okay. So these are some strategies to promote active student engagement. And I talked about that snowball in the chat earlier, which is my favorite. But if you guys have one on this list that you want to know what it is, or maybe one that you have used, let me know. But these are some strategies to promote active student engagement. There are nonverbal ways, there are verbal ways, and there are team and group ways that we could do this. We could think about our lesson plan, and the more actively involved our students are, the higher our outcomes are going to be. So for nonverbal, guided notes, stop and jot, hand signals, and response cards. Have you guys had success with these? Do you use these in your classroom? I would love to hear it in the chat. And some that maybe you're like, I don't know what that is. I'm going to explain some of them really quickly so we can go through this. But verbal, there's think, pair, share. That's pretty much a lot of people know what that is. But making sure they have wait time to jot down before we meet with the pair. So having some time to think about it and not just talk to somebody next to each other, but really having that wait time is great. Whip around. Have you guys heard of that one, or do you know what that one is? There's choral, responding, and then there's responsive, verbal, that students are going to talk back back to you. Team and groups, snowball, everybody does it. Stations, four corners, gallery walk, cued retell, number heads together. So that's a lot of engagement strategies. Does anybody, Alex or William, have any that you want to know what they are, or some that you use, or some that work well? While I talk, I'm going to explain my snowball unless you guys know what it is. So this one I use with teachers, I use with and students as well. Nikki has too. You can use any question that you want, and all the students have to answer it. So say you're in math class and you're like, okay, we're doing whatever you're doing, division. I want you to show your work. Everybody gets to, here's the question. Everybody has to write down the answer, and they have to show their work. Then everybody, or what, you could do it in ELA. We could talk about how that works too. Everybody takes their paper, they crumble it in like a snowball. Now, and think about your class. Think about if you could do this or not. But I have seen it where there's two groups. So I don't know, it depends how many students you have. You kind of cut it in half, and they throw the balls all around the room to each other, their answers. We do it 3 times, or how many ever times the teacher sets it. And then you have to pick another person's snowball up. And then you open it, and it's not going to be your response. So then they talk to each other about the question, the answer, showing their work, if it was right or wrong. So it really is safe, because it's not your own answer. You could get it wrong. You're critiquing somebody else's work, and you're going to talk to somebody else. So we're going to use that random pairing, and then they're going to be able to talk out why it's wrong or why it's not, or some sort of an answer. I use Snowball. We have IEP training. And so we talk about writing goals, measurable goals. So I ask teachers to write their goals. And then we have a snowball fight in in the training, and we pick a different person's goal, and then they can talk about that goal, and they can talk about, is it progress, not, are you able is it a good goal? Is it measurable? Is it compliant? And you learn that way. And I've gotten good feedback from that. So I don't know, do you guys think you could try that in your classroom, or do you think it would be too wild? Nikki said in her middle school, they would have a target at the front of the room, and they would all do whatever. And she did ELA also. So they would have, what's the character development in this, whatever story. You can use any question, and the kids will write the responses, and then they can throw the snowballs at a target, and then they win, and they got another person's response. It incorporates movement, which we know students need. It incorporates pairing them together randomly, and it just builds culture and community in your classroom. So that is a high leverage practice. Is anytime we can get those students to engage with us, that's one that I've seen really work well with adults and with students. And Nikki also said that her class liked that too. Depending on if you think you could do that in your class, it is a good one.
Alana,
Yes.
You mentioned when you said special education, you do that with the IEP. Just some thoughts on your thoughts, and you as well, Nikki, on students who might have auditory processing, their engagement. How do we make sure that they're taken care of so they can fully engage in this gen ed classroom with some of the issues they may have?
Yeah, so I would definitely make sure, I mean, even when if they can maybe go to a quieter part of the room once they get their snowball, and to talk to each other, because we have had trainings when adults have a hard time hearing. And so I wasn't, if I'm aware, I could definitely do that as a teacher. I think that they can still be involved in doing all those things, but making sure they have maybe a quiet place to debrief with each other would be helpful for that, because it is a lot of things going on. So if you're not used to that, but thanks, John, that's a great point. And I like William, he said he uses pair share, choice boards and stations, but more fun to throw snowballs at each other. So I really hope that you try it, because it is really fun. I've had good luck with it. Another one that I really like, and we talk about this only because the research has said when students get into middle school and high school, some kids do not even interact with the teacher at all. They go into the classroom, they sit down, they go to their Chromebook, they go on Canvas, they do their work, they submit it. And there's a lot of teachers, as the kids get older, have less time for kids that raise their hand get asked the question or answer the questions, but not everybody does. And so we know that to increase outcomes, we have to increase engagement. And so the whip around is a really great one. If there's a question that has a lot of different answers, like just for a very generic example, we're talking about the United States of America, everybody say a state. That's just very elementary. Everybody gets a chance to answer. So I know that at least I've heard from every person that class. So that's just the whip around. So if you have something that has a lot of possible answers or maybe thoughts, if you don't know an answer, you can say pass. If you think of the same answer as somebody else, you can say the same answer as them. So if you're like Indiana, that somebody else says Indiana, because that's the only thing I can think of, say it, because then at least you've heard everybody's voice in your class. And we know that we need to increase that engagement for everybody's voice to be heard, because really in middle school and high school, the research is really low on those opportunities to respond. So thinking about your lessons and how often the kids can talk to you and talk to each other is really important. And we know that we will get more gains out of that. So those are just some ideas for you. And I know that you guys use some already. So thinking about maybe I could add something else. We have some resources where we got these, and we actually have videos. So if you're like, I need to see cued retail in real life, there's actually a video that we have in here so that you can go and look at it and see what would work for your classroom. Anybody else have anything before I move on? Thank you, William. That was great. So we know that students can respond in various ways. If you have students with EL, English as a second language in your classroom, or if you service these students, I have seen how just red and green cards are super helpful. And we know that those kids need visuals. Also, I was a special education teacher, so I definitely used response cards. I used whiteboards. I think it's, Nikki talked about fist to five. I always say, because I taught middle school, cell phone bars. I have 0 bars to 5 bars. If I have no service, I'm in trouble. If I have 5, I'm good, because middle school kids know what cell phones are. So I try to be cool. I'm definitely not. But that's one way I kind of do that. These are different engagement strategies as well. They kind of go further. I like this slide. We're going to give it to you so that you can have it. But there's different things that you could do. We've talked about a lot of them, but debating maybe, or thinking about what in my lessons could I do with students to have them more engaged? Could I have them rhyme something with their vocabulary words? Can I have them, do a screencastify so they could have a podcast? Anytime you can get those kids to be engaged in their way, creative, it's really helpful for kids. So these are just some different ways. If you see anything on here that you've tried, let me know. If you think that you could try something, let me know. I would never want to sing. I would never want to sing. That would not be something I would choose, but maybe some of your students would. So just thinking about how you could get them to show you what they know in a different way will increase your engagement in your class.
I just wanted to share that this morning I saw a really great example of a debate, and they did it instead of a bell ringer. And the question, the group had been, it was an earth space class in high school. And the day before they'd been talking about the relative distance between planets. And the question was a would you rather, and I don't even remember which 2 planets it was, but it was, would you rather take a trip from this planet to this planet or this one to this one? And so students had to use what they knew about each, whether it was the distance or whether it was the climate or something they knew about the planet itself, and they had to decide which one they would rather do. And the student, and then as the students were coming in for bell work, it was they had to make the decision and then go to one side of the room or the other to discuss. So instead of just individual at your seat bell work, it was make a decision and then go there and dig right into a conversation about the content. And it was really great to see that debate piece of it, but also how students were really pulling what they knew from the day before to answer this would you rather question it seemed pretty fun for them. So it's kind of
That sounds
neat.
awesome.
Yeah.
That sounds great. Thanks. You can move on to the next slide. So opportunities to respond, again, we've talked about this. How often do students respond in a lesson? Can you increase the opportunities to respond in your next lesson? What have you tried and what could you try? So I, as a teacher, I always wanted to grow so that I would, if I learned about OTRs, and I did, I went back and I'm like, how often do I respond to have kids respond to me? And this is just an example of some different ways that they can question. So we'll show this really 30-second video, quick video.
What we were doing yesterday? Maya?
Multiply.
That's right, we were multiplying. Look at the equation on the board. What would the answer to that equation be? Vitor?
The answer is 6.
You say the answer is 6. If you agree with Vitor that the answer is 6, put your thumb up. Lainey, how do you know that the answer is 6?
Anything multiplied by 2 is double the number.
That's double. So Vitor, why is the answer not 5?
Because the X stands for multiplication, not addition.
That's correct. The operation is?
Multiply.
Good.
And that was just a quick, the Cyberus.com has a bunch of different ones and it shows you what they look like in their classroom. But really the the biggest thing for me is oftentimes in math class, we ask one student at a time, and just a easy shift would be, do you guys agree or not, disagree or not, so that everybody can answer, because a lot of times everybody wants to raise their hand and answer, but then you only could, of course, ask one person. So to get more engagement and more opportunities to respond, you can say yes or no, or why or why not, and get choral responses going. You can go to the next slide. Because in the research, Dr. Terry Scott's kind of like leading the way in this, but he says that 3 per minute is about what we're supposed to be asking students, which sounds like a lot, and it could be. So we're going to see what that looks like with Dr. Scott right now.
Who remembers what page we were on with fractions yesterday when we stopped? Yeah, what?
246.
246 is right. Could I see everybody turn to page 246, please? That's where we're going to start today. When you get to page 246, I'd like you to look for the part that says improper fractions. That's where we left off. Put your finger on it where it says improper fractions, please. Improper fractions, got your finger there? Okay, so if you see there, the step says how to divide. So I want you to look at this first one up here on the board. Raise your hand if you think you know the answer to this one. Yeah, what do you think the answer is to this one?
2.
She says that it could be simplified to 2. Raise your green card if you agree with her. Lots of agreement. I agree also. It is 2. Very good. That's exactly the way you do it. You divide. So if she's right and we divide, then what I'd like you to do is write down the answer to this one on your paper real quick. Okay, so notice that some were to the group, some were to individual. The data that we have right now says results look good when you have a mixture of about 4 or 5 groups per every one individual.
All right, so he just showed us different ways to use opportunity to respond. We saw the response cards, we saw everybody, or we saw individuals answering. At point to the paper, everybody has to point, or to your computer, but really just try to increasing that engagement with the content is very helpful. We know he does the work around this, and he has studied the same schools, the same poverty, the same SES, all the same things. And the only thing different by high achieving schools is that their teachers are ask more OTRs, opportunities to respond, than the other schools. So kids are more engaged in the content and with each other. So we know that it will bring results. So that's why it's so important to have to look at our lesson plans and to see how often are students talking to each other and talking to us. So that's why it's such a big deal. Yes, John, do you want to say?
I just noticed that, Alex, you had respond to anything in music. That's interesting.
Yeah.
That, I don't know what that would look like, but that sounds interesting.
Like rapping, like something,
Yeah.
or yeah,
Yeah,
I would
maybe
not be
wrong,
good
but,
in
Alex,
it.
it's
Like
fun.
music or listening to music. Yeah.
Absolutely. Thank you for sharing that, Alex.
Yeah, and Alex, if you want to share that later,
Sorry.
explain more about that, that'd be great.
Yes, she's more than welcome.
I typically I rely on YouTube for everything, but if I can find any kind of video that relates to a subject, I use a lot of Go Noodle videos. I'm primary with the lower kids, so like syllable count and things like that. I know there's a few fun Go Noodles that are also kinesthetic. That tends to be how I get my students to engage and pick up on concept faster.
Great.
I love that. That's great.
Absolutely
Yeah,
great.
so special, and they have to move around, right? There's you have little ones, you have like stand up if you do this, sit down if you do this. Yeah, you definitely have to keep it moving for sure. So we're back with the scenario at the beginning, and we're talking about managing behavior during the math lesson. So since we have all of these different ways for engagement, if you want, you could put it in the chat. What do you think that would be helpful for this lesson? If we walked into this class and you're saying, and we always talk about, we look at the instruction, we look at the curriculum, and then we look at the environment before we look at the learners. So what could we change about the instruction, curriculum, or environment before looking at our learners? We know that they're bored. We know that they're kind of all like raising their hand, but the same students are asking the questions. Have you ever seen like a classroom where you know that the smart kid in the front is going to answer all the questions? So you just kind of like, I don't have to do it. I've seen that. And so they're not kind of paying attention. But what's one way to maybe increase engagement in this class if you see that going on? If you think Alex, William, or somebody else came in. If you want to put it in the chat, if not, we can move on. It's not a big deal, but this is kind of if we were in person, we kind of would brainstorm this out together.
I really also wanted to add that something that I heard in Dr. Scott's presentations last year when he was at our EE conference was that, one of the things you notice is that he didn't argue that every student had to respond for each, right? Every student had the opportunity to point at page 247, had the opportunity to raise their hand if they agree or disagree. But he said, I didn't waste time arguing with every student about this. So I didn't stop the entire class to say, 3 people didn't put their finger on number 247. So that really is a management piece that he notices. And I think there are times, especially those of you who are teaching the littler ones, there are times when we need everybody on the exact same page. But at that secondary level, if you really just want them, if you're giving them opportunities to respond, it's okay for them from that buffet to take what they need and what they can use most.
We can move on. And for this one, I would say that we would just add some whiteboards or some different ways for students to all, because if they're yelling out, they might want to talk. And if only one person's answering the question at one time, then maybe that could be a way. That's an easy way to do, I think, to do a math that everybody has to write it down so that we can see if it's going on or not. And then not only one person's answering all of the questions.
Just very quickly with Mr. Sanchez, I
Yes.
would be looking at that mutual respect. What does respect look like in the classroom? We're not going to yell out. So when you establish that organization within the classroom, that day one, what's this going to look like? Just some ground rules and norms for whole group, as well as then you as a teacher making it engaging, making sure they have all those OTRs. But those basic principles of classroom organization and management have to be in place.
Yeah, I think another great gateway opportunity here to add would be a quick turn and talk. Turn to the person near you, tell them how you got what you got, tell them the steps, those kinds of things. That's another great, easy one to implement.
Great, thanks. And then Nikki, I think you're do the last one.
All right, this last section, we're going to focus on high leverage practice number 21, which has to do with teaching our students to maintain and generalize new learning across both time and settings. I feel like the conversation it happens often in math, but lately it's been so often the conversation in literacy. How can we make sure our students are being able to take the same skills they learn when they're decoding words in first grade that's going to take them into that morphology practice as they decode multisyllabic words as they get into 3rd, 4th, 5th grade and beyond, those things. So if you've been hearing a lot about generalization and maintenance, those are some pretty hot topics right now, especially in that science of reading literature. With that, we want to make sure that we're teaching the practical use of skills. So not just, let's say our letter A and make the sound 100 times. Let's talk about how we use that short A in CVC words and in all of these places and how we're going to use them throughout the bigger skill and throughout the application piece of the skill. You also want to make sure that you're removing scaffolded supports very gradually. So we start off doing a lot of the heavy lift as teachers, right? We have to put in all the support. We have to make sure they see that metacognitive piece we talked about last time, where we're showing them how we think and what we think. And then we slowly begin to back some of those things off and see how they can take over the skill and show some ownership of that. We also encourage our students and provide for them supports like checklists, graphic organizers, different prompts across a unit. If you are doing a particular unit in math that consistently requires them to be really good at their math facts, can we give them a math fact chart? Because I was in an algebra class this week and she said, well, we're kind of beyond the part where I'm testing them on their math facts. I need to see if they understand the steps to solving this equation. And so if that's what we're testing, then let's give them the support of the math fact chart so that we can see if they understand the algebra skill, not so much worrying about that, about the math facts at that point. And then looking at how they can transfer those skills to other projects as well. Finally, explicitly identifying supports and their multi-purpose use. How can we use this support? If we have this really great graphic organizer that works in literacy, can it also work in science class? Can it work in social studies? Can it work in my, whatever other class you're taking as you get through that secondary level? So with that, it's important to know that generalization really has to do with demonstrating a behavior or skill in settings that are different. So this is the simplest version of this, but I heard it in a training and it stuck with me. If we're thinking about generalization, that means that you have a young child who's potty trained at home. Yep, sure, they're fine, they're potty trained at home, but when you send that same child to preschool and they're distracted by friends and it's a different environment and there's different potties and all of those things, is that potty trained skill that they have at home going to carry over into that different environment? And that's the same way we want our skills to be when we're teaching with our instruction as well. So if we're teaching something simple about, say, evaluating equations, then the question is, if it works on Monday when we practice with skills, practice equation problems that don't have any negative numbers, then we wonder if by a few days later, can students apply those same steps to solve an equation to a problem that has negative numbers? And so making sure that it's being generalized across a setting, and that could be a physical setting like the potty example, but it also can be a content setting. So can we change from being able to do that here with fractions, but then follow those same steps when we have negative numbers or different things like that. Generalization components have to be built into instruction. This means that we have to plan ahead throughout a unit. Maybe at the beginning of the unit, we're really supporting students with organizational skills. By the end in that unit, we've already taught them how to use a graphic organizer that helps them organize ideas. So when we get to this, when we get to the third section, say, of the chapter, or if you're reading a novel, when you get to chapter 5, suddenly students are able to create the plot diagram of that chapter, or they're able to use that graphic organizer independently because we've put the skills in place throughout. So even with a new text, they can still create a plot diagram, not just the same one that they did with their teacher, that same story. There are different across settings is one type of generalization, but also across behaviors within the content area, and then over time. So that means in 6 months from now, when it comes to be time for that iLearn test, do our students remember that? Do they own that information so well that they can pull it from that part of their, the depths of their brain, the things that you taught them before Christmas or before that holiday break? And that does come with part of generalization, is that piece where we're going to provide that cyclical review and using those skills and applying them to other settings to keep them practicing with the skill. I keep double clicking, sorry. So when we do this, it's really important to note that generalization happens through very careful planning. It doesn't happen magically. It's not something that is natural a lot of times for teachers. I always think about it because I know as a teacher, I know the skill. So I assume that our students will not just know the skill, but also I assume that it can be applied in different settings and that students know that. We have to be really aware of that metacognitive piece, making sure we're teaching in a way that allows students to apply it in those different ways and carry those skills across time, setting, and tasks. So that means that we have to look at sequential modification. That means that we're going to keep with the same sequence across settings and tasks. So one example I have of that for you is with the CHAMPS behavior management program. Behavior management framework, excuse me. When I was teaching, we used CHAMPS, and that meant that I gave directions for each activity that we did in a very particular order. C was for conversation. So I would right off the bat tell students, right now, I need to be able to give you a model. I need your voice level to be a 0. Conversation level 0, that means you're not talking, I'm talking. And we would give very specific examples of conversation, how they should ask for help during that time, exactly defining what activity they would be doing. And then the M in CHAMPS was for movement. And I had a student who would always listen for that M. We did CHAMPS for about 6 weeks before that student said, Avina, I am always in trouble when it comes to movement. I know my other teachers, they tell me I am back and forth to the trash can, I'm wiggling out of my seat, all of this. When you get to M, I know that that's what I need to know. My voice will be managed. I know how to get help when I need it. All of those things are great, but I need to hear the M. And on days when he was feeling extra stressed, I would always hear him say, "Come on, M, 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 M." And he'd be listening for that. It was such a unique thing. But making sure that those same sequences, when you're trying to teach a particular skill, in that case it was behavior, you want to make sure that you offer it in that same sequence so that your students know what to listen for. They train themselves to listen for that. They also are able to find shortcuts within that part. That's their own brain problem solving and finding ways to shorten it. So if you're doing longer math problems, this is where your students might be able to do something in their head, right? And they skip that step on their paper. But again, they did it on their paper enough times, they saw the exact sequence you followed on the board or in your model, and they're able to take that sequence and apply it. Even if they're applying it in their brains, they're still following that same sequence piece. Also make sure that when you are teaching a new skill, you train a little loosely. You train with some variation in there. That means it could be a change in the format, people, setting. That means that those of you who are co-teaching, let your co-teacher say it a little differently sometimes. That doesn't mean changing up everything, but it means see if they can notice that there's maybe a slight difference in vocabulary, or if, I had a student who was always obsessed with the color of the pen. Did you ever notice that you use purple and Mrs. A uses green? I hadn't paid that much attention. I think we each just got it on sale, but we want to train loosely so that the day that you pick up that green pen on accident, the student still knows that that's the skill you're using. So looking for opportunities to say, we've practiced negative numbers for an entire unit, but negative numbers can come up in fractions and in exponents and in all of these different things throughout our math curriculum. So making sure they see those opportunities for application there. Other things to continue would be that common stimuli for consideration. Design instruction so that it's like that bell with the dog, with Pavlov's dog. We want them to see signals, that those could be visual signals, auditory signals, things that we do. If our students say tornado and they see you swirl your finger every single time, the next time they're reading independently and they see that T, they're going to hear it in their brains, T to tornado, and they make that swirling piece of it. All of those settings are going to create that stimulus so that their brains can find that information that they need. And also making sure that we're really mediating that. We have to make sure that we show, I use a graphic organizer because this is what it helps me to do. And then we model the use of that graphic organizer. Or the next time you're reading aloud with that same student and you get to a word, you say, okay, I see the beginning, that's tornado. And they see you using that same skill so that they can then process and generalize that as well. The more we show them what we're thinking, the more they're going to be able to use those same skills as they go through. There are some things to consider about levels of prompting. We use this generally when we're looking at or when we're training paraprofessionals so that they understand how invasive these things are for students. So making sure that we understand that earlier in our units of instruction or in our work with behavior, really anything, we know that there are things for our students that are the most invasive, right? When we're verbally calling them out, when we've got that tap or that touch, those kinds of things are invasive for students. That keeps them dependent on us as the adult. We have to be part of that process because they need our verbal prompting, because they need that physical prompt. But as you scoot over in the rainbow of these promptings, you get to things where there's a model first, right? If I model a math problem that we practiced the day before, or a concept that we practiced the day before, we model, then the students are able to take that and go with it because there's a clear model in front of them on the board. Again, I saw this in a great way in an algebra classroom this week where the teacher was able to do it, then keep it on the the screen for the students so that they kept referring to it so they knew the steps were right as they were applying it to other problems. There's also things like gestures or visual cues. John mentioned the sentence stems from the video in our previous training. Those sentence stems are great ones because that is a prompt for our students, but we don't have to be involved in that. They had those stems waiting for them there in the canister for that discussion piece of it. But as the adult, we didn't have to be part of that. We didn't have to verbally give them that sentence stem. Okay, and then oh, Alana says she loved that chart. Sorry, I had to scroll down a little bit to see that. This chart really is a great way. Paraprofessionals love seeing this one to really think about how they get involved in the classroom with students and ways to be effective, but giving students levels of independence. I like this one when I think about designing a unit for students. I know that I have to be more involved at the beginning, and then I can slowly let them develop more independence with the skill throughout. I always question myself when I'm designing curriculum. How am I letting students be more independent as this goes on? All right, so some ways that we can reduce that prompt dependency. If you feel like you are consistently having to be involved, even if your students, we've been working on this for a while, some things to ask yourself, some questions to say, do we have systematic routines in place? Do your students know what's coming next? Do they have that exact prompt, the exact steps in front of them? And that's where maybe we need to add a visual cue, like those sentence stems, where we can kind of take a step back, but they still have that piece of it. And then eventually slowly looking if you can remove those sentence stems and if you still see the repeated behavior happen throughout there. Also look for ways that you can add natural cues. This is where some of our students have to learn, we always say read the room, right? So what kind of natural cues can we teach students? What do you see on your classmates' faces if you're in a group and you're discussing something? How can you tell if your classmates think maybe you're way off? And or how can you look around at the response cards to figure out how you're aligning with what everyone else is understanding as we go through that? So don't be shy to explicitly teach your students about some of those natural cues. Another great opportunity for this is to really use wait time. Instead of starting, say, with that graphic organizer, maybe asking students the question and waiting to see how they approach it without that graphic organizer before offering that prompt. And maybe you'll find that some students do still need the prompt and other students are ready to move on independently with that. Also, the plan to fade prompts, letting your students know upfront and explicitly, things like, as much as we don't necessarily teach to the test, we have to prepare for the test, right? We have to know what that is. And we want to be able to tell our students, boy, in all of our writing pieces, there's always a graphic organizer. Sometimes I make them for you. Sometimes you create your own. But how would you approach that on, the iLearn, where you have to create your own graphic organizer? What steps would you take? What steps would you take when you don't have to have a graphic organizer? The directions don't force you to. What's the value to using that graphic organizer? So making sure there's a plan to fade prompts, but also having students understand the purpose and importance of some of those prompts so that they know when they need to own the prompt and create those things for themselves in order to be successful. Again, just making sure this is part of your planning. We really want you to plan ahead for generalization. Make sure you know upfront what the target behavior is. At the end of this lesson, at the end of this unit, this is what will happen. My students will get here. And how am I going to provide the explicit instruction necessary? This might be where our students need a concept broken down, or maybe we teach, similar things over 3 days, but instead of the lesson plan with content changing, the lesson plan can be that we reduce prompts. I see this oftentimes in those elementary literacy blocks where a particular reading series might offer 5 stories for a week. That's a lot for students to read, but what we know is that if, at the beginning of the week, we're doing that as a whole group, and then we have all these extra options of additional stories and things that are written at instructional level, that we can give them the opportunity to plan and to attack the text on their own with those prompts reduced, or even in small group where the prompt isn't reduced, where they have still significant support. But though we have to plan ahead for that, to use all of those resources that are offered in those kinds of curriculums and textbooks. Offering supports for our students, making sure you plan ahead for it, to think about which graphic organizer works best for this content. What are the steps that I'm taking? So I've tried this activity in my mind, what I'm going to do tomorrow. I've tried the activity. I'm going to have to break it down for my students this way, and offering those supports embedded. And then really working on using that colorful chart to fade those supports over time. All right, so as we wrap up today, we are just a little bit early. I'm sorry about that, but I'm sure after a long day of teaching, you might not be as sorry. But I wanted to share this reflection opportunity with you. When you really consider all of the information that we covered in the last hour and 10 minutes, I just want you to think about one activity in each category that made you say, that could work in my classroom. And jot it down for yourself somewhere, whether it's on a sticky note or in the corner of your plan book. Maybe you're thinking, that snowball has to make it to my classroom somewhere the next week. And so put snowball down as your active engagement strategy. Or maybe you want to try something with those split half pairing to see how your students do when they have that skill gap between them. So think about those different opportunities that we discussed today. And I'm going to give you just a moment to choose 3 things that you can put into place over the next week, hopefully in your classroom, as we head into Thanksgiving break.
Or there were some good things in the chat that you guys are already doing. So you could validate like, hey, I'm doing, I use a lot of think, pair, share. I use this and these are working. So keep on using those too, because then I always like to do that. If I was at a training and somebody was talking and I'm like, hey, I do that already. So make sure that you pat yourself on the back and say, hey, I'm doing all these great things. And so I like that too, because I appreciated the chat today. We had a lot of good active participation in there.
You can also, during this activity, without being able to look back at the other slides, this is a good exercise. When we're done, pull up these slides on the Padlet, go through those and use the same type of chart or the same activity. Say, yes, oh, I forgot about, they talked about that. That's right, here it is. That's what I want to use. So if you do it here, if you don't do it here at this moment, this is really valuable when you can see all the slides and go back and actually then apply something that we've talked about.
Absolutely. Thank you, John. And thank you to all of you who stuck with us throughout this. In the interest of making sure that your time is valued here, I do want to offer these resources to you. Alana mentioned earlier that there are videos of each of these engagement strategies in practice in real classrooms. So if you're interested in those, the ones you mentioned on that CBER Center, and then there's also some other really great opportunities here to learn more about high leverage practices, as well as our next, the 4th in the series here coming up in November. I do also want to share with you our evaluation sheet. So I encourage you to use the QR code on the left side to scan and then fill out our evaluation, just to let our boss know that we came today and gave you some ideas that were hopefully great. And if not, that you can figure out how to sift through if you need to find out what works for you. Hopefully everybody got something like that. We also encourage you to check out all of the offerings that we have available to you on our website, which is iepta.org. That's the QR code there on the right.